The official record is thin, almost clinical. It notes that on October 27, 2023, an unauthorized medical evacuation helicopter, call sign Dustoff 723, departed forward operating base Dagger amidst a Category 4 superstorm. It notes the objective, a stranded Marine reconnaissance unit, designated Marauder, pinned down in the treacherous Hindu Kush Mountains. What the record doesn't capture, what it couldn't possibly convey, was the sheer, breathtaking insanity of the act. On the radar screens in the Tactical Operations Center, Dustoff 723 was a lone, green blip, a suicidal moth drawn to a meteorological flame. The storm, named Indra by the weather watchers, was a swirling vortex of cyclonic winds, lightning, and zero visibility rain that had grounded all air assets across the entire theater of operations. Direct orders had been issued, no flights, no exceptions. The Marauders were on their own. Yet, someone was in that cockpit wrestling a 15,000-pound machine of steel and rotor blades into the teeth of a god's fury. The initial reaction, in the talk, was not concern, it was rage. Colonel Marcus Thorne, his face a mask of thunder, slammed his fist on the console. "Who the hell is in that bird?" he roared, his voice cutting through the tense hum of the command center. "I want a name, and I want it now. They are violating a direct order and flying to their death." Flight operations officers scrambled, their fingers flying across keyboards, checking rosters, flight schedules, and maintenance logs. No one was scheduled. No flight plan had been filed. The helicopter itself had been undergoing routine maintenance. Listed as not operational, it was a ghost ship, piloted by a ghost, flying into a storm that was erasing the world. The mystery deepened with every passing second. The blip continued its impossible journey. Who would do this? Who would steal a helicopter and fly solo into a hurricane to save 7 men everyone else had already written off? The answer, when it finally came, would shake the foundations of the entire battalion, forcing them to question everything they thought they knew about courage, duty, and the quiet, unassuming pilot they had also tragically underestimated. Warrant Officer Anya Sharma was a creature of the sky, but for the past 6 months she had been tethered to the earth. Her call sign was Kite, a name bestowed upon her not with affection, but with a biting irony that followed her like a shadow. Kites were fragile, subject to the whims of the wind, easily broken. 2 years prior, during a routine transport mission, her Black Hawk had been clipped by an RPG, the tail rotor shredded, sending them into an uncontrolled spin. By all accounts, it was an unrecoverable disaster. Yet Sharma had fought the controls, wrestling the dying bird into a crash that saved the lives of her crew and passengers. The investigation cleared her of any wrongdoing, but the incident left a stain. She was labeled a risk-taker, an adrenaline junkie who flew too close to the edge. The promotion she was due for was quietly shelved. She was grounded, reassigned, to a desk job overseeing maintenance schedules and flight logistics, a pilot's purgatory. The younger pilots, fresh-faced and brimming with unearned confidence, treated her with a mixture of pity and condescension. They saw the quiet woman with the haunted eyes and the call sign that sounded like a joke, and they dismissed her. They didn't see the hours she spent in the simulators, her hands moving over the controls with a fluid grace that was more instinct than training. They didn't know about the nights she spent poring over topographical maps, memorizing every ridge, valley, and canyon within a 100-mile radius of the FOB, and they certainly didn't know about the promise she had made. The leader of the stranded Marauder unit, Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne, the colonel's estranged, hard-headed younger brother, had been her first crew chief. He was the one who had pulled her from the wreckage of that first crash, his own arm, shattered. Before they were airlifted out, she had looked him in the eye and said, "I owe you one, Gunny." It was a debt she intended to pay, regardless of the cost. So, while the others saw a broken pilot, Sharma was simply waiting for the right wind to catch her wings. Back in the Tactical Operations Center, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic cocktail of confusion and fury. "What do you mean you don't know who it is?" Colonel Thorne bellowed, his gaze fixed on the radar screen where the solitary blip of Dustoff 723 pulsed with defiant life. "That is a multi-million-dollar piece of military hardware, and you're telling me it just sprouted wings and flew away?" The flight operations officer, a young lieutenant barely out of flight school, stammered, "Sir, the logs are clear. The bird was in maintenance bay for it wasn't even on the active flight line." Thorne's eyes narrowed. This was no longer just a case of insubordination, it was a major security breach. He turned to his communications chief. "Get me a direct channel to that aircraft." Now, the comms chief worked frantically, cycling through frequencies. Dust off 7 to 3. This is Dagger Talk. Come in. Over. The only reply was the angry hiss of static. The storm was a wall of electromagnetic interference, swallowing all transmissions. Indra was not just a physical barrier, it was a communications blackout. Outside, the fob was being hammered. Rain fell in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the steel walls of the operations center. The lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the tense faces of the command staff. On the main screen, the weather overlay showed a terrifying, swirling mass of red and yellow. At its heart, where the winds were strongest and the turbulence most violent, was the single, lonely blip of dust off 7 to 3. It was flying directly into the core. A grizzled master sergeant, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, muttered to the man next to him, "Whoever that is, they're not trying to fly through it, they're using the storm as cover." The idea was so audacious, so contrary to every rule of aviation, that it hung in the air for a moment, unbelievable. But as they watched the blip hold its course, steady and unwavering, a new chilling realization began to dawn. This wasn't a joyride, this wasn't a panic-induced mistake, this was a plan, a deliberate, calculated, and utterly suicidal plan. For the 7 men of Marauder Unit, the world had shrunk to a miserable muddy ledge on the side of a mountain. Pinned down by an overwhelming enemy force that held the high ground, they had been taking fire for 6 straight hours. The freezing rain had soaked them to the bone, and the wind threatened to tear them from their precarious cover. Their situation was dire. 2 of their men were down with critical gunshot wounds, their lifeblood staining the rocky soil. A third had a compound fracture in his leg, the bone jutting out at a sickening angle. They were out of morphine, low on ammo, and their radio was dying. Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne, a man forged in the crucible of combat, knew they were on the verge of being overrun. He had made the call for an emergency medevac 3 times. The first 2 times, the request was denied due to the escalating weather. The 3rd time, the response was a flat, final negative. All air assets grounded. Indra is a no-fly zone. Hope, a fragile commodity in this brutal landscape, had evaporated. They were alone. Then, through the deafening roar of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain, they heard it. A faint, rhythmic hump-hump-himp. It was a sound so out of place, so impossible in these conditions, that they thought it was a hallucination, a trick of the wind playing on their exhausted minds. A young Marine, his face pale with shock, looked at the gunny. "Is that—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Elias Thorne strained his ears, tilting his head. Against the gale, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of rotor blades cutting through the storm. It was the sound of a helicopter. He crawled to the edge of their position, peering through the thick, gray curtain of rain. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, a light flickered through the clouds, a single strobing beacon. A dark shape materialized from the storm, a phantom in the maelstrom. It was a Black Hawk, flying dangerously low, its landing lights cutting feeble paths through the deluge. It wasn't just any Black Hawk. He recognized the red cross painted on its side. It was a dust-off, a medevac, a miracle. "Get the wounded ready," he yelled, his voice raw with a mixture of disbelief and renewed hope. "Our ride is here." The name finally crackled over the internal coms in the talk, delivered by a stunned maintenance chief who had just done a manual headcount. "Sir, it's Sharma, Warrant Officer Anya Sharma." The name dropped into the charged atmosphere of the command center like a lead weight. Colonel Thorne went rigid, his face paling slightly. Sharma, the pilot he had personally grounded, the one they called Kite, of all the pilots on his base, it was her. The quiet, broken woman he had relegated to a desk. The fury in his eyes was instantly replaced by a cold, dreadful certainty. This was not just insubordination, it was a personal betrayal. He felt a surge of protective anger for his younger brother Elias, trapped on that mountain. The last thing he needed was some reckless, washed-up pilot playing hero and getting them all killed. He snatched the microphone from the comms chief. "Patch me through, now. Use the emergency guard frequency. I don't care if you have to bounce it off a satellite. Get me that helicopter." After a tense minute of static and frantic adjustments, a connection was made, fragile and tenuous. "Dust off 7 to 3. This is Colonel Thorne. You are in violation of a direct order. I am ordering you to abort your mission and return to base immediately. Acknowledge." The voice that came back was faint, distorted by the storm, but unmistakably female, and it was calm. Terrifyingly calm. "Colonel, this is Dust off 7 to 3. I have positive contact with Marauder's position." Thorne's voice was ice. Warrant Officer Sharma, I am not giving you a suggestion, I am giving you a direct order. Turn that aircraft around. Now that is an order. There was a pause, a moment filled only with the sound of the raging storm. The entire talk held its breath, listening. They expected a justification, an argument, perhaps even a plea. They did not expect the 3 words that followed, delivered, with a resolve as unyielding as the mountain she was flying towards. Negative, sir, kite is on station. The line went dead. The blip on the radar continued its inexorable path. Colonel Thorne stood in stunned silence, the microphone slipping from his hand. She had not only disobeyed him, she had used that ridiculous, mocking call sign. It was a final act of defiance, a declaration that the fragile kite was now flying free, and he had no power to pull it back. Inside the cockpit of Dustoff 7-3, the world was a symphony of violence. The Black Hawk, a machine designed for stability and power, was being tossed about like a child's toy. Alarms blared in a chaotic chorus as instruments failed, overwhelmed by the storm's fury. The rain hammered against the reinforced glass of the windshield, not as individual drops, but as a solid wall of water, rendering visibility to absolute zero. Anya Sharma was not flying the helicopter, she was fused with it, her hands and feet moving in a constant, fluid dance on the controls. Every gust of wind that threatened to flip them over was met with a precise, counterintuitive adjustment of the cyclic and collective. Every lightning strike that lit up the cabin in a blinding, disorienting flash was ignored, her eyes fixed on the one instrument that still worked, the simple, old-fashioned magnetic compass. She was flying blind, navigating by memory and feel. She knew this terrain intimately, not from satellite images, but from the hundreds of hours she had spent flying over it, committing every peak and valley to a 3-dimensional map inside her head. She could feel the proximity of the canyon walls through the subtle changes in air pressure, the way the wind echoed and eddied around the fuselage. The roar of the engines and the shriek of the wind were deafening, but in her mind there was a profound silence. Her focus was absolute, a meditative state born of extreme stress and supreme confidence. There was no room for fear. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her body ached with the strain of fighting the controls, her muscles burning with lactic acid. But her mind was clear, sharp, and focused on a single point, the small, muddy ledge where 7 men were waiting. She wasn't thinking about Colonel Thorne's orders or the court-martial that would inevitably follow if she survived. She was thinking about Elias, the young crew chief who had pulled her from a burning wreck, his own face a mask of pain and determination. She was thinking about the promise she had made. In this maelstrom, she was not Warrant Officer Sharma, the grounded pilot. She was Kite, and she was rising on the storm, using its destructive power to carry her towards her purpose. The call sign, Kite, had been born from the ashes of her first command. When her Black Hawk went down in the Korangal Valley, the Valley of Death, the crash was so violent it destroyed their primary radio and emergency locator beacon. They were miles off course, deep in hostile territory, with her crew chief, a young Elias Thorne, bleeding out from a shrapnel wound. For 2 days, they evaded enemy patrols, Sharma practically carrying Elias as they moved from one hiding place to another. Hope was dwindling. Search parties would be looking in the wrong place. That's when she remembered the emergency survival kit. Inside, among the flares and first aid supplies, was a small, tightly packed signal kite made of bright orange, ripstop nylon. The other pilots had always laughed at it during survival training. When are you ever gonna use that thing? They'd jeer, hope for a windy day. Now, surrounded by the towering mountains that blocked all line of sight, a windy day was their only hope. As Elias faded in and out of consciousness, Sharma assembled the kite. Using the last of her energy, she scrambled to the highest point she could find and launched it into the turbulent mountain air. For hours, she held the line, her hands raw, the small orange diamond a tiny speck of defiance against the vast, indifferent sky. It was that speck that a high-altitude surveillance drone spotted, a flicker of unnatural color in a landscape of rock and green. The rescue team was guided to their exact position. She had saved his life, and her own, with a child's toy. When she returned to base, the story spread, but instead of admiration, it was twisted into a joke. She hadn't heroically landed a crippled bird, she had crashed it. She hadn't bravely saved her crew, she had gotten lucky with a kite. The name stuck, a constant, stinging reminder of her perceived fragility. They meant it as an insult, a way to diminish her skill and her survival. But they had misunderstood. A kite doesn't fight the wind. It uses it. It harnesses the very force that seeks to destroy it, and turns it into an instrument of ascension. They thought the name made her weak. They never realized it was the secret to her strength. On the ground, the sight of the approaching Black Hawk was both a salvation and a terror. Marines of Marauder Unit watched as the helicopter fought its way towards them, pitching and yawing violently in the wind. One moment it would drop 50 feet in a sudden downdraft, the next it would be shoved sideways by a ferocious gust. It looked less like a controlled flight and more like a fall, a desperate struggle against gravity and wind. "It's a single pilot," one of the Marines screamed over the storm. "I can only see one helmet in the cockpit." Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne's heart sank. A solo flight in these conditions wasn't just risky, it was a death wish. The pilot would be fighting the controls with every ounce of their strength, with no co-pilot to manage the radios, navigation, or systems. Who in their right mind would even attempt this? "Pop smoke," he ordered, his voice tight. "Mark our position. Let's give them a target." A Marine pulled the pin on a smoke grenade, but the wind was so strong it tore the thick, colored smoke apart before it could even form a plume. It was useless. The pilot was going to have to find them visually, in a storm that had reduced visibility to the length of a football field. The helicopter began its approach, descending towards their narrow ledge. The sound was overwhelming, a physical force that vibrated through their chests. The rotor wash, combined with the storm's winds, created a hurricane within a hurricane, kicking up rocks and debris. They had to shield their faces to keep from being blinded. Elias had a critical decision to make. Moving the wounded, especially the man with a compound fracture, would be agonizing and dangerous in this chaos. But leaving them here meant certain death. There was no choice. "All right, listen up," he bellowed, his voice barely audible over the tempest. "We're gonna do this fast and clean. 2 men on each litter. I want the most critical loaded first. Move like your lives depend on it, because they do. Go." As the Marines scrambled to prepare the wounded, Elias watched the helicopter's final approach. It was a masterclass in flying, a delicate and brutal ballet. He didn't know who was in that cockpit, but he knew one thing for certain: they were either the best pilot he had ever seen, or the craziest. The final 50 feet of the descent were an eternity. Anya Sharma's world had shrunk to the view through the rain-streaked windshield and the feel of the controls in her hands. The landing zone was a sliver of rock barely wider than her rotor blades, a treacherous perch surrounded by a sheer drop of 1,000 feet on one side and a jagged cliff face on the other. The wind was a malevolent, living entity, trying to smash her against the mountain. It came in unpredictable waves, a crosswind from the left, then a downdraft from above, then an updraft from the canyon below. Her feet danced on the end pedals, keeping the helicopter's nose pointed straight, while her right hand made 1,000-minute adjustments to the cyclic, tilting the rotor disc to counteract the gusts. Her left hand held the collective, the source of their lift, pulling and pushing to maintain a steady rate of descent. The groaning of the airframe was a constant, terrifying sound. The rotor blades flexed and strained under the immense pressure, threatening to shear off. A warning light flashed on her console HUD. "Press low." A hydraulic leak. She was losing the fluid that gave her the strength to control the aircraft. Soon the controls would stiffen, becoming impossibly heavy. She had minutes, maybe seconds. Before she lost control completely, she ignored the light. Her focus was absolute. Through the sheets of rain, she could see them now, small figures in green, moving with purpose, their faces turned up towards her. She saw the litters, she saw the desperation, she saw Elias, his familiar rugged form directing his men. That sight gave her a surge of adrenaline, a final burst of strength. With a final delicate maneuver, she brought the Black Hawk into a hover just inches above the ledge. She couldn't land fully. The ground was too uneven. She would have to hold this position, a stationary point in the heart of the storm, while they loaded the wounded. It was the most difficult and dangerous maneuver in aviation, and she had to do it solo in a hurricane, with a failing aircraft. With a grunt of exertion, she pulled the collective and held the helicopter steady, her entire body screaming in protest. The side door slid open. The ramp was down. As the side door of the Black Hawk slid open, Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne was the first one there, waving his men forward with the litters. The noise was indescribable, a physical assault of sound and wind. He had to lean into the rotor wash just to stay on his feet. He looked up towards the cockpit, trying to get a glimpse of the pilot, this madman or madwoman who had come for them. He saw a single figure, helmeted and anonymous, their body tense with the strain of holding the aircraft in its precarious hover. The first litter was loaded, then the second. The Marines worked with a desperate efficiency, their movements economical and precise. They were ghosts in the storm, their faces grim. As they prepared to load the third and final litter, Elias moved to the cockpit door, his hand resting on the frame. He had to shout to be heard over the roar, "We're almost there, just hold on." The pilot turned their head slightly, and for a brief moment, their eyes met through the visor. In that instant, Elias knew. He didn't know how he knew, but the certainty was absolute. The set of the jaw, the intensity in those eyes, the sheer, bloody-minded determination radiating from that small frame. It was her. Anya Sharma, Kite. The pilot everyone had written off. The woman he had pulled from a wreck 2 years ago. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over him. Shock, disbelief, and a sudden, profound sense of awe. All the mockery, all the jokes about her call sign, evaporated in the face of the impossible reality before him. She wasn't just holding on. She was commanding the storm, bending it to her will. He saw the sweat beading on her temple, the corded muscles in her neck, the tremor of exhaustion and strain running through her arms. He also saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, a debt being paid. He gave a sharp, single nod, a gesture of respect so deep it transcended words. Then he turned back to his men. "Get on board. Everyone on board." Now his voice had changed. The skepticism was gone, replaced by an urgent, unwavering faith in the pilot he had once pitied. The takeoff was a controlled crash in reverse. The Black Hawk, now laden with the extra weight of 7 Marines and their gear, felt sluggish, unresponsive. As Anya Sharma pulled on the collective, the engines screamed in protest, straining to generate enough lift to break free from the mountains. Grip, the hydraulic failure warning was no longer flashing. It was a steady, ominous red light on her console. The controls were becoming stiff, like trying to steer through wet concrete. She had to use her whole body, her legs and torso braced, to force the aircraft to respond. A sudden, vicious gust of wind caught them as they cleared the ledge, slamming them sideways towards the cliff face. The rotor blades, spinning at hundreds of revolutions per minute, came within inches of striking the rock. A collision would have been catastrophic, turning the helicopter into a fireball of shrapnel and fuel. Anya shoved the cyclic hard to the left, a desperate full-body maneuver that sent a jolt of pain through her already screaming muscles. The helicopter lurched away from the cliff, dropping precariously into the canyon below. They were airborne, but they were far from safe. As they climbed, the storm swallowed them whole once more. The brief connection to the ground, the sight of the Marines, was gone. She was alone again in the violent, grey void. She tried the radio. "Marauder is secure. Dust-off 7-3 is RTB." The only response was a crackle of static. She knew, with a sinking feeling, that the fob would have lost her on radar the moment she dropped into the canyon. To them, she had simply vanished. In the back, Elias Thorne and his men were being thrown around the cabin like dice in a cup. They clung to the webbing on the walls, their knuckles white. Through the small windows, all they could see was a swirling, featureless gray. They were completely blind, their lives entirely in the hands of the lone pilot in the cockpit. Elias looked at the faces of his men, young, terrified, but alive. He then looked towards the cockpit door, where Anya was fighting, a battle he could only begin to imagine. The fragile kite was now carrying them all, and the string was about to break. In the dagger talk, the green blip representing dust-off 7-3 flickered once, twice, and then vanished from the radar screen. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the rain against the roof and the faint, mocking hiss of static from the speakers. Every eye was fixed on the empty space on the screen where the blip had been. "Get it back," Colonel Thorne said, his voice quiet, devoid of its earlier rage. "Reacquire now." The radar operator worked his controls, his face pale. "No joy." "Sir, I've got nothing." The signal was lost when she dropped below the ridge. The communications chief tried the radio again and again, his calls swallowed by the storm. "Dust-off 723. This is Dagger talk. How copy?" "Silence." "Kite. This is Dagger. Report your status." Silence. The use of her call sign, the one everyone had used as a joke, now felt like a desperate plea. A heavy, unspoken finality settled over the room. A solo pilot, in a storm of this magnitude, in a failing aircraft, flying into the most treacherous terrain in the country. The odds weren't just long, they were non-existent. The master sergeant who had predicted her strategy now bowed his head, muttering a quiet prayer. The young pilots who had mocked her stood in a tight, silent group, their faces a mixture of shame and disbelief. They had dismissed her as a washed-up relic, and she had just flown into a legend, even if it was her last flight. Colonel Thorne sank into his chair, the weight of command pressing down on him. He was now facing the loss of a multi-million-dollar helicopter, a decorated warrant officer, and the 7 men of Marauder Unit, including his own brother. The rage had completely drained away, leaving behind a hollow, aching grief. He had given an order, and she had disobeyed it to save his brother's life. Now, it seemed, they were all lost. He picked up a pen, his hand trembling slightly, and began the grim task of drafting the initial casualty report. The first name he wrote was his own. He had failed them. The cabin of the Black Hawk was a pocket of chaos suspended in the void. In the dim red glow of the emergency lighting, Anya Sharma was fighting a war on 2 fronts. Outside, the storm raged, a relentless physical assault. Inside, she was fighting to keep 7 wounded men alive. With the helicopter on a albeit terrifying flight path, she had engaged the autopilot's rudimentary altitude hold function, a gamble. As the system wasn't designed for this kind of turbulence, it gave her precious seconds. Unstrapping herself from the pilot's seat, she scrambled into the back, the helicopter lurching violently beneath her. She was not just their pilot, she was their medic. The 2 most critical Marines were fading. Fast one had a sucking chest wound, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. The other was pale and clammy, his pulse weak from internal bleeding. Anya worked with a practiced, desperate urgency. She applied a chest seal to the first Marine, the plastic crackling as it sealed the wound. She started a new 4-line for the second, her fingers surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline and the violent motion of the aircraft. She moved from man to man, checking vitals, adjusting bandages, and speaking to them in a low, calm voice that cut through their pain and fear. "Stay with me, Moraine. Just stay with me. We're almost home." Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne watched her, mesmerized. She moved with an economy of motion, her face a mask of intense concentration. This was not the quiet, reserved woman from the FOB. This was a warrior, a Valkyrie, in flight gear, refusing to let her charges die. She was flying blind, through a hurricane, in a crippled machine, and yet here she was, tending to his men as if they were in a state-of-the-art trauma bay. The autopilot shrieked a warning, and the helicopter dropped suddenly. Anya launched herself back into the cockpit, grabbing the controls just in time to pull them out of a steep dive. She strapped herself back in, her chest heaving, her body screaming with fatigue. She was flying on instinct, memory, and sheer force of will. Every fiber of her being wanted to give up, to surrender to the exhaustion, but then she would hear a groan from the back, and she would remember the faces of the men whose lives depended on her. She was their only hope. The kite had to keep flying, but what felt like an eternity, the dagger talk remained a tomb. The mood was somber, the air thick with unspoken grief. The process of notifying next of kin had begun, a duty Colonel Thorne dreaded more than combat itself. The storm outside had begun to lessen its intensity, its fury abating, a cruel irony that only deepened the sense of loss. They had been so close. Then, it happened. A faint, almost imperceptible sound broke through the static. It was a voice, distorted, broken, but a voice nonetheless. RGGER. This is UST. Off. Copy. The entire room froze. Heads snapped up. The comms chief, his eyes wide, slammed his hands on his headset, frantically adjusting the squelch and gain. "Say again, dust off. Say again, you're breaking up." The voice came again, slightly clearer this time, a woman's voice, strained and exhausted, but impossibly, miraculously, there. "Fob dagger. This is kite. Request. Immediate medical. Landing pad. 7 souls on board. Critical." A collective gasp went through the room. It was her. She was alive. Colonel Thorne shot to his feet, his chair clattering to the floor. The grief on his face was replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. "Where is she?" he yelled at the radar operator. "Find her." The operator's fingers flew across the console. She's close. Northeast. Less than 5 clicks out. Flying below the radar line. She's coming in at treetop level." The somber silence of the talk exploded into a flurry of controlled, purposeful activity. "Get me a clear path," Thorne commanded. "Alert the crash crew and the medical team. I want every medic on that pad. Now. Light it up. Light up the entire damn landing zone like it's Christmas morning." The news spread through the base like wildfire. The ghost ship was returning. The pilot they had mourned was coming home. Men poured out of the barracks and workshops, their faces turned towards the sky, searching for a sign. They were no longer just waiting for a helicopter, they were waiting for a miracle. And through the breaking clouds they saw it. a single flickering light, a beacon of impossible hope, emerging from the heart of the storm. As if orchestrated by a divine hand, the moment Dustoff 7-3 cleared the final ridgeline, the storm broke. The dense, grey curtain of rain parted, and shafts of pale morning sunlight pierced through the clouds. The wind, which had been a raging monster, gentled into a steady, sighing breeze. The world, which had been a swirling chaos of grey and black, was suddenly painted in the soft colors of dawn, and in the center of it all was the helicopter. It was a horrifying, beautiful sight. The Black Hawk was battered and broken. One of the side windows was shattered, and the fuselage was pocked, with dents and scars from flying debris. It flew with a noticeable limp, a wounded bird struggling to reach its nest. It was trailing a thin, dark plume of smoke from its port engine. Every person on Fobdagger was outside now, a silent, stunned audience. They stood on rooftops, by the perimeter fences, and lined the edges of the flight line. The pilots who had mocked her, the maintenance crews who had doubted her, the command staff who had condemned her, they were all there, their faces a mixture of awe, reverence, and shame. They watched as the crippled helicopter made its final, agonizingly slow approach. It didn't fly so much as stagger through the air, its rotor blades making a sick, uneven sound. It was clear that the pilot was not just flying on skill anymore, she was flying on fumes and faith. The silence was absolute, a sacred hush that had fallen over the entire base. No one spoke, no one moved. They just watched, their hearts in their throats, as this ghost from the storm fought its way home. Colonel Thorne stood on the edge of the landing pad, his face unreadable. He watched the machine that carried his brother, a machine piloted by the woman he had been ready to send to prison. He had been a soldier for 30 years. He had seen countless acts of bravery, of sacrifice, of skill. He had never seen anything like this. This wasn't in any training manual. This wasn't a calculated risk. This was an act of pure, impossible will. The kite was coming home to roost, and she was bringing the storm-tossed souls with her. The landing was not a landing, it was a fall. In the final 20 feet of its approach, the port engine, which had been smoking, finally gave out with a gut-wrenching screech of tortured metal. The Black Hawk lurched violently to one side, its nose dipping towards the ground. A collective cry of horror rose from the crowd. They were so close. To lose them now would be an unbearable cruelty. But in the cockpit, Anya Sharma had one last fight in her. With the last of her strength, she hauled back on the cyclic and slammed her foot on the right pedal, using the remaining power from the starboard engine and the momentum of the tail rotor to swing the aircraft around and level it out. The helicopter hit the helipad not with the gentle grace of a controlled landing, but with a bone-jarring crash that sent shudders through the concrete. The landing gear collapsed under the impact, and the Black Hawk settled onto its belly with a final, exhausted groan. For a moment, there was absolute, ringing silence. The engine spooled down, the rotor blades slowly ceased their turn. The smoking wreck sat motionless in the center of the pad. No one breathed. Then, the side door, buckled from the impact, was forced open from the inside. The uninjured Marines, led by Elias Thorne, began to emerge, helping their wounded comrades. The waiting medical teams surged forward, a wave of green uniforms and red crosses, their movements swift and efficient. They swarmed the helicopter, pulling out the litters, assessing the wounded, a whirlwind of life-saving action. But all eyes were on the cockpit. The door was pushed open, and Colonel Thorne was the first to reach it. He looked inside and saw Anya Sharma. She was slumped forward, her helmeted head resting against the control panel. Her hands were still gripping the cyclic and collective, her knuckles white, even in unconsciousness. She had flown the helicopter until the very last second, until her body had nothing left to give. She was not moving, she was alive, her breathing shallow but steady. She had brought them all home. The fragile kite had carried 7 souls through the storm and delivered them from the mouth of hell. And now, her flight was over. In the days that followed, a profound change swept through Fobdagger. The story of Sharma's flight spread not like gossip, but like a gospel. The details were repeated in hushed, reverent tones in the mess halls, the barracks, and the maintenance bays. The mockery that had once surrounded the call sign kite was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding respect. The name was now spoken with the same reverence reserved for heroes of legend. Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne became the unofficial keeper of the flame. He stood for hours by the wrecked Black Hawk, which sat on the edge of the flight line like a monument. He would touch the scarred fuselage, his expression a mixture of gratitude and wonder. When younger Marines, new to the base, would ask what happened, He would tell them the story. He told them of the hopelessness on that mountain ledge, of the impossible sound of rotors in the storm, of the lone pilot who wrestled a broken machine through a hurricane. His voice, usually hard and cynical, would soften. "You see that name?" he'd say, pointing to the faint, stenciled letters kite below the cockpit window. "That's not a joke. That's a promise. It means that even when the whole world tells you it's impossible, even when the storm is raging and you're all alone, you don't give up. You find the wind, and you fly." The other pilots who had once belittled her now sought out the flight logs, the radar data, trying to comprehend the sheer aeronautical skill it had taken to do what she did. They couldn't. The data didn't make sense. Her flight path was a jagged, impossible line that defied the laws of physics and aviation. It was, one of them muttered, not flying, but an act of faith. The wrecked helicopter itself became an icon. Soldiers would walk by and touch it, as if to draw strength from its resilience. They saw in its battered frame a reflection of their own struggles, and in its survival, a symbol of their own hope. Anya Sharma, still recovering in the field hospital, had become more than a pilot. She had become a legend. The official investigation was a formality, but a necessary one. Colonel Marcus Thorne, the man who had been ready to have Warrant Officer Sharma arrested and court-martialed for insubordination, now found himself in the surreal position of dictating a recommendation for the Medal of Honor. He sat across from the investigators, his voice steady as he recounted the events. He left nothing out. His direct order to turn back, her calm refusal, the loss of contact, the agonizing wait, and the miraculous return. Her actions, he concluded, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed, were in direct violation of my orders. They were also the single bravest act I have ever witnessed. She placed the lives of 7 Marines, including my own brother, above her career, her safety, and her own life. There is no medal, no commendation, that can truly honor what she did. The investigators compiled their report. They interviewed the men of Marauder Unit, the radar operators, the maintenance crew who confirmed the helicopter's non-operational status and the hydraulic leak. The final document was thick with technical data, radar plots, and sworn testimonies. But it was a sterile, lifeless account. It could record the wind speeds, the altitude, the flight duration. It could not record the feeling in the talk when her voice came back from the dead. It could not capture the look on the faces of the Marines when they saw that helicopter emerge from the storm. It could not quantify the sheer force of will required to fly a broken machine through a tempest. The official story was one of an exceptional pilot performing an extraordinary feat. But the real story, the one that would be told for years to come, was simpler and far more powerful. It was the story of Kite. The name, once a symbol of weakness, was now her official, registered call sign. It was etched into the new helicopter that was assigned to her. The fragile toy had become an unbreakable emblem of courage. The legend was now official. Anya Sharma woke to the quiet, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the antiseptic smell of the field hospital. Her body felt like one massive, throbbing bruise. Every muscle ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. A figure rose from a chair in the corner of the room. It was Gunnery Sergeant Elias Thorne. His arm was in a sling, but he stood tall, his face etched with a weary relief. For a long moment they just looked at each other, the silence filled with all the things that didn't need to be said. He had been sitting there for 2 days, refusing to leave until she woke up. "Hey," he finally said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Hey, Gunny," she whispered, her own voice raspy. "The men, they're all gonna make it," he said. "Thanks to you." He walked over to her bedside. He fumbled in the pocket of his fatigues with his good hand and pulled out a small, folded object. He placed it gently on the blanket next to her. It was a kite, a simple, makeshift kite, crafted with surprising care from a green military poncho, and 2 cross sticks. The string was a length of paracord. It was a crude, humble thing, but it was the most powerful symbol in the world. It was a gesture of understanding, of shared history, of a debt repaid in full. It was his way of saying that he finally understood the meaning of her name. He knew what it felt like to be broken, lost, and saved by a fragile piece of fabric dancing on the wind. "The Colonel," Anya started to say, her brow furrowing with worry about the consequences of her actions. Elias cut her off. "The Colonel is fine," he said, with a slight, knowing smile. "He's busy writing you up for a medal." Anya stared at the small, green kite, her vision blurring with tears. They weren't tears of pain or sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming release. The weight she had carried for 2 years, the sting of the mockery, the burden of being underestimated, it all just washed away. She was no longer the broken pilot. She was Kite, and she had flown. Years later, the story of Kite's flight became a part of the institutional memory, a modern military fable taught to new recruits at flight school. It was a lesson not just in aviation, but in the nature of courage. The instructors would point to a framed photograph on the wall of the main briefing room. It showed a battered Black Hawk, its belly on the tarmac, surrounded by a crowd of awestruck soldiers. The name Kite, they would explain, was not about fragility. It was about resilience. It was about the ability to harness the forces that oppose you and use them to soar. The legend of Anya Sharma was not just about the 7 lives she saved that day. It was about the countless minds she changed. She had shattered the caricature of the reckless female pilot, replacing it with a new archetype, one of quiet competence, unwavering resolve, and unimaginable grit. Her legacy was in the young female pilots who now walked the flight lines with a confidence they might not have otherwise had. Their path made a little easier by the woman who flew into a storm, an older, wiser Anya Sharma, now a chief warrant officer and a master aviator, would sometimes stand on the observation deck, watching the new generation of pilots practice their maneuvers. She rarely spoke of that day, but she didn't have to. The small, green poncho Kite, given to her by Elias Thorne, sat on her desk, a constant, silent reminder. The sky, once a place of trauma and conflict, had become a space of peace and possibility for her. She had faced the worst it had to offer, and had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. The final narrative of her flight was not about a soldier disobeying orders. It was about a human being honoring a promise. It was a testament to the idea that true heroism is often found not in the thunder of battle, but in the quiet, stubborn refusal to let hope die, even in the heart of the storm. The lone pilot who flew into the impossible had proven that sometimes the most fragile-seeming things are Kite, a promise, a single human will are the most powerful forces of all.